This is Think Out Loud on OPB. I'm Allison Frost. It's hard to overstate the impact of reproductive care on women's lives. Maternal care reduces the number of women who die from childbirth and pregnancy-related complications. Control over fertility is integral to women's autonomy and freedom. Now, with the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade and many states banning abortion, Mary Fariba Afsari's work is more important than ever. She's an OB-GYN in Portland, and she's written a memoir, Labor, One Woman's Work. In it, she tells the story of her own practice and of the women that have received reproductive and other medical care from her. Some of that care was in a traditional setting, but some was provided in a 31-foot RV that she turned into a mobile women's health clinic. And woven into Labor is Afsari's grandmother's story, who died from an illegal abortion in Iran. We should note that this conversation was recorded in the midst of the Supreme Court case that could have dramatically limited access to a medical abortion drug routinely prescribed via telehealth. The plaintiffs in that case did not prevail, but other challenges to reproductive care remain. I began by asking Afsari, whose family immigrated from Iran several decades ago, if she still has family there.
We do. We have relatives. I have aunts and cousins and uncles, folks that are scattered throughout Iran in different cities. We are in some sort of contact with them. Everybody will tell you that there is an internet blackout. And so it does make communication really challenging. So whenever they get a little bit of cell service or they can see that there's a little signal, we will usually get a message from them just to let us know that they're doing okay.
And how are you doing? How are you doing?
Unfortunately, this is not new. I mean, we have been in the United States for over 40 years now. And if you can think back over the last 4 to 5 decades, the turmoil that has happened not just in that country, but between our countries. So we're fairly, unfortunately, used to there being war and fear. We are also really supportive and proud of the Iranian people who have shown incredible resilience, courage through radical movements, the feminist movement in 2022, and even now just really staying strong in terms of what their beliefs are, their quest, their hope for a democratic future.
Thank you for that. Well, let's turn now to the book. I'd like to actually begin how you began, with a car crash. It's a very moving scene. But it's also somewhat of a surprising start, since it has nothing to do with abortion or reproductive care per se. Why did you want to begin here?
I tell this story about being at the end of a clinic day, and it was, about 10 years into my career. And most physicians, OB-GYNs, ER docs, you can name the specialty, will probably share that 10 years into a really busy career, there's some element of, we call it burnout, we call it moral injury, whatever you want to call it. You've put in a lot of work. I mean, up until that point, you also put in 8, 10, 12 years of education to get there. And so I was at that stage, and I had young kids. I was in a private practice. I was constantly being called in the middle of the night, taking really long call shifts, sometimes 24 hours, sometimes 72 hours of being the doctor that was covering the entire hospital. And so I start this book with a chapter where I had just on a whim decided that I needed to dye my hair mermaid hair color. So turquoise and pink, and it was sort of a trend. It was about 10, 12 years ago. And in the middle of all of this, driving home, I was the first responder, essentially, to come upon an accident where there was a woman's body on the road, and there was no EMT, no paramedics, no ambulance yet on the scene.
And there was a woman lying there that you knew was already dead on impact.
Yeah, the significance of that moment in that scene was to share with the readers a little bit about me. I wanted the readers to learn that I'm a person who went into this profession with a great deal of idealism and hope and desire to help people in their lives. Most doctors do. And that even though I was experiencing this sort of stress and exhaustion at this point in my career, it didn't take away from that desire to make a difference. And there was something really impactful, probably metaphorical, in coming across a woman on the road who everybody was looking to me to see if there was any chance to save her. I knew that that was not likely to happen, and I still went through the motions. And there's just a lot of symbolism in that, in terms of being a woman at that point in your life, being a mother trying to keep it all together, being a doctor who is doing their best in a system that's not always supportive of that. So I open the whole book with that scene, and I hope that it draws people in to being a little more curious about me and my life.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk more about your life. You talk about your relationship with your father and how he sort of pressured you, if I have that right, into becoming a doctor, and you resisted. At some point, you decided to go to medical school, but obstetrics and gynecology was not your original plan, right? When you started med school, how did you end up choosing the field?
I really thought I was going to do something with kids. I was going to do pediatrics. I did have a little bit of a journey to deciding finally to go to medical school. And when I decided to go, I thought it would be very joyful for me to work with children. And I ended up taking a month during medical school. I had the opportunity to go to Bolivia and do a rotation, which was incredible. It was a pediatrics rotation. So we visited orphanages. We were in rural clinics where 50, 70, 100 mothers would be lined up on every day for us to do exams on their newborns. And we were also inside of the cities. And over and over and over again, I got this very strong sort of feeling that when a mother is not taken care of, it's really difficult to take care of the children in that family. And at that time, it was not easy to obtain birth control in Bolivia. And I ended up in a rural hospital actually working with an OB-GYN. And I can probably credit him for turning my mind around about the work that I was going to do. He was putting IUDs in women who had purchased them off of the black market and brought them in their purses. It was a Catholic hospital. We were not supposed to be doing birth control. And one after another, he was putting IUDs in these women. And he would explain to me that some of them had had 10, 12, 13, 15 pregnancies, maybe that many babies. And along the way, most of them had lost a few children, like a 7-year-old or a 9-year-old who had at some point gotten sick, or maybe they had a disability and there just wasn't the resources available to care for those children. So these mothers had lost babies and children, and they were trying to keep their families together, and there was no end in sight in terms of their pregnancies unless we did something about it. And so it sort of turned my mind around. I came back from that month in Bolivia, and I refocused myself on women's health care.
Of course, it's very different in the U.S., a lot of other issues. What do you think people don't know about this field? Or what are some misconceptions that you run into?
It's been interesting since the book has come out. It's been out now for a couple of months, and I have really good friends reading the book. I had a friend, we've been friends since we were 10 years old, and she said to me, I feel like I don't even know you, because the stories that I share in the book are not the stories that we typically share as OB-GYNs. So the perception is that an OB-GYN is a doctor who takes care of pregnant women, and we have the great privilege of being in the delivery room in this joyful time for mothers and families and the siblings and the grandparents. And that is all true. That is a part of our job. We are also the front lines for any emergency that comes in the door that involves reproductive health care, which can be quite catastrophic. If you imagine a young woman, a pregnant woman, there's hemorrhaging, there's stroke, there's high blood pressure, there's every condition that we see in anybody, but now magnify it in amplitude because there's a baby involved. And there are some really high-risk conditions that are only pregnancy related. And so there are middle of the night, racing down the highway. There are very, very rapid C-sections that have to be performed, hoping that you got there in time. And there's a lot of stress and grief and trauma that happens both to the physicians, the entire staff taking care of those patients, and then obviously the families themselves that are impacted. And that is a side of the profession I wanted people to become aware of, because at a time when my colleagues are being put under pressure to perform sort of the standard of care medicine that we were trained to provide, we're talking about life-saving procedures that in certain states have become illegal or very difficult to actually find somebody who can do that. I want people to understand what a loss that is, because if it's your mother or your sister or your wife who is arriving at a hospital and you don't have that specialist available to do the surgery that they need to potentially save their life, it is going to matter on a very personal level. And so I told these stories in a very personal way.
If you're just tuning in, I'm talking to Dr. Mary Fariba Afsari, OB-GYN and author of the new memoir, Labor. Well, let's turn to your grandmother, whose story you also tell, Mary. What did you know about her growing up?
I knew very little. My name was changed when I was in kindergarten, and I talk about that. It's a pretty typical immigrant kid story. Your parents immigrate, you were given a traditional name from the country that you were from. For me, it was Fariba. And Fariba Afsari is a hard name to say today. And at the time, in the early 80s, we were living through the hostage crisis. Iran was on the news every single day. And my parents really wanted to protect us. And so they changed my name from Fariba to Mary. And I thought they were just giving me this common American name. And it wasn't until I was in my late 20s, early 30s that my mother shared with me that her mother's name had been Mehri. And the reason she chose Mary was after her mother. And that sparked this huge curiosity in me because I realized we never spoke about my grandmother. I knew that she had died when my mother was 4. And from that moment on, I really had no information about her. Wow. And I wanted to know how she had died.
How did you find out those details of her death?
I asked questions. I asked my parents. I asked, their siblings. And there was a confusion about what had killed her. She had been pregnant. It was her 5th pregnancy, and she was 26 years old. And at the time, there were some assumptions that were made. Maybe she had high blood pressure, or maybe she had experienced a stroke. At this point, I had been an OB-GYN for 10 years. And so I figured I'm actually the expert in this condition. Whatever it is that killed her, I probably should understand. And it wasn't until one of my aunties, who was visiting from Iran at the time, pulled me outside and shared with me something that she had heard from the women in their town, that I started to put the pieces together about how she had died.
Would you read a passage from the book about her several weeks after she discovered she was pregnant on 102? But before you read that, tell us where she is, roughly how old she is, and who she's talking to.
Sure. And for context, I reimagined my grandmother's story. And so I will call this a fictionalized version of how I imagined her discovering that she was pregnant again. And she finds herself in a hammam, which is a traditional bathhouse, which back in the 1950s was pretty customary for women and men. They would go separately to separate bathhouses in order to bathe and sometimes spend the afternoon. So she finds herself in this bathhouse and she runs into an old friend.
And how many kids does she have at this point?
She has 4 children.
Already, okay.
Yes. Did you ever want more than 2 children? Mehri formed the words carefully. She was surprised by Nilu's laugh in response. More than 2 children? Never. Of course not. Don't you think if I wanted more than 2 children, I would have more? She asked the question as if the answer was obvious. So then, how? Mehri stopped her sentence when she looked at Nilu's face. Nilu immediately turned serious. Mehri, are you saying that you don't know how to stop yourself from having babies? Her hand reached out again, and she grabbed Mehri's hand, her thumb stroking the top of her knuckles. You know that there are ways to not have babies, right? She asked the question again because Mehri's body froze. Only her neck could move, and it twitched back and forth.
Mehri ended up getting a mixture of herbs to drink to induce an abortion, but she didn't take it right away in your story. And of course, as any memoirist, as you said, you had to create the dialogue, create the scenes, maybe more than usual, in a way that I found very effective. Can you describe, again, in your mind, why she would have waited and her ruminations about the soul?
Yes, I found it really interesting when I was doing some research for this book to learn that there are many religions that actually allow for a termination of a pregnancy in sort of a forgivable manner, depending on how far along the pregnancy is. And in her case, she had referred to some scriptures. There's a book of Hadith, it's called, and it implies that the soul of a baby doesn't enter the fetus until about 16 weeks. And so she was trying to make the decision about ending the pregnancy and trying to make sure that she did it in a timely way, so that if she were to end the pregnancy, that it would happen before the ruh is what's known as the soul, that she would do it before that happened.
And she had to estimate how far along she was. That seems like an impossible task given the amount of care that she likely had.
Yeah, she already had a 1-year-old, and so it can be really difficult to know when you become pregnant and how pregnant you are in that situation.
It also seemed to me to sort of echo with a lot of stories I've heard about women who it's not a snap decision, right? It's very difficult sometimes, and so you might wait a little while, even in this day and age when abortion, certainly in Oregon, is more available. And I thought that really called back so nicely from the past to the present. Let's talk about Oregon for a second. We have strong protections for abortion and reproductive care, but so much has changed since the Dobbs decision in 2022, overturning Roe v. Wade, which you mentioned. You write about your reaction to this when it happened on your last day of a road trip to Idaho, where, of course, abortion is now illegal. Would you mind reading a little bit of that on page 148?
Sure.
And is there anything else we should know?
Prior to this day, I had already conceived and started a mobile reproductive health clinic.
Which we will talk about much more, but yes.
So it had already been sort of in the back of my mind that this day was going to happen. And so when it did happen, as I write about, it wasn't the biggest surprise to me or to those of us who were really entrenched in the world of reproductive health care. But I know that it came as a shock and a devastation to many, many people in the country.
Thank you.
I picked up a large coffee from the Stanley Baking Company and started the 9-hour drive back to Portland. I wish I had thought to time-lapse video record the drive, because in my somewhat numb, somewhat agitated state of mind, I did recognize the irony of my road trip. It was the distance the women of Idaho would now have to travel to obtain an abortion, since Idaho had enacted one of the strictest anti-abortion laws in the country. How is anybody surprised? I said out loud, again and again. Arriving back in Portland that day in June, I felt the stillness. When I walked into my usual coffee shop the next morning, the barista looked up at me, her eyes puffed and red from crying. I nodded. She nodded back. I took my drink and stood next to her at the counter. What the f***? She shook her head. She was 21 years old, and her reproductive years were still ahead of her. I was 48 years old, and my fears of unintended pregnancy were basically behind me. This news was her news, but also mine. She was a person who could get pregnant and not have options around the pregnancy. I was a person whom politicians were vocally trying to criminalize. We were now in lockstep, handcuffed by our government's decision.
Tell me more about why you use that word, handcuffed.
People were literally getting handcuffed. I mean, we have seen it since, and we were starting to see it even back then. So women who had undergone abortions were being put on trial. I was hearing stories about my colleagues who were OB-GYNs who had ankle bracelets, and couldn't leave the state because they had elected to perform life-saving procedures on their patients. And so the handcuff was actually something that we could predict was going to actually happen in real life.
When a pregnant patient comes to you seeking to end their pregnancy, how much do you rely on medication abortion?
I think we would say that we all rely on it quite a bit. It is the go-to sort of that a lot of women want, especially if they're candidates for it, if they're at a stage in their pregnancy where it's safe to be able to avoid a procedure and to avoid the disruption that might cause. A lot of people choose medication.
Is it fair to say that the majority, or even more than the majority, are going to be eligible because they're not that far along in the gestation?
Yes, I would say that's fair.
As you know, access to mifepristone via telemedicine hangs in the balance. Do you think your practice would be affected?
Of course. Anything that's happening on a national level affects all of us on a local level. It doesn't just have to do with access. It has to do with perception. It has to do with fear. It has to do with what women think they have access to. It has to do with the information that they're receiving and that they're taking in. Everybody's watching everything all the time now. I'm going to say that even in Oregon, we struggle sometimes to get the medications that we need because pharmacies either don't have them available. They require paperwork from those of us that might be prescribing them. There might be only one pharmacy in town that carries it, and if they're closed, there's no other way to get it. And I mean, this is in Oregon. And so the fact that a medication that has been deemed to be extremely safe and effective is just not more readily available impacts all of us.
Well, tell us more about starting that mobile health clinic. And at that time that you started it, you still had a successful traditional practice. So what was your vision for the clinic?
I had been in a brick and mortar practice out in East County, a place that's close to my heart, a real traditional community OB-GYN practice. It was dreamy in the sense that I saw patients from their first pregnancies, sometimes to their hysterectomies. I might have delivered 3 to 4 of their babies. I could walk around town and people knew who I was. From a doctor and a community standpoint, it was really ideal. I worked at a hospital that I loved, performing surgeries and delivering babies. And yet, even in that scenario, it was very clear to me that there were plenty of women in other counties and in other areas, and potentially now we know in other states, that would have no way of accessing care. Even my patients sometimes were taking multiple buses to get to a 10-minute appointment just to check on their pregnancy, and they would have 3 kids with them. I also had patients who were siphoning gas in order to get enough gas to drive to the hospital when they were in labor. So this is just 20 minutes outside of Portland. So we can only imagine what's happening 2 hours, 3 hours in rural communities. We now know we've lost 35% of our OBs in Idaho. These maternity care deserts that are propping up all over the country. So back then, I could sort of see down the pipeline that we were going to lose a lot in terms of access. And all I could think is, what if I could just take myself, my team, an obstetrics table, some speculums, the birth control that we need, the procedures that we do, the ultrasound machine. What if we could just take ourselves anywhere? And so the idea was just to put that into an RV and do it. And we started building that out basically in very early 2022.
You make it sound so so straightforward and easy, but you also write in the book about all of the things, all of the challenges, some of them funny, about getting this together. I mean, turning a 31-foot RV into a mobile health clinic. How quickly after you got started did women find you? I mean, did it take a while, or, how did that build?
It was an interesting start. I think I knew that I needed to start in a community that knew me. So I had been in Portland for over 10 years. I had a good reputation. I already had doctors who would refer me patients. I had a huge panel of my own patients who said that they would see me anywhere. So I was like, well, put your money where your mouth is because we're going into the back of an RV. And they started showing up. It is a self-funded startup. It was a pretty scrappy operation. It continues to be on some levels that way. But we just put ourselves out on Facebook groups and let folks know where we were going to be. And I will just say for the first 3 to 4 months, maybe we had 10 patients in a week. And now we have a panel of over 2,000 patients that we have seen in about 3 years.
Wow. When you first started it, what was the reaction from your friends and your family? I'm thinking particularly of your dad.
It was very mixed. I am obviously probably more on the risk-taking side of how I like to live my life. I like the idea of the unknown and of adventure and not knowing exactly how things are going to play out. To this day, there are really very few, if any, other full-service OB-GYN mobile clinics in the country, so we didn't have anything to model ourselves after. I have very organized type A friends, and I appreciate them so much. And they wanted to know what my business plan was. They wanted to know the details of where I was going to park. My dad wanted to know how we were going to stay safe and just not have anybody just show up off the side of the road. And every time those questions got asked and I didn't have answers for them, I personally got more excited. But I'm going to say this, and I really feel so strongly about it, is that a lot of people questioned whether or not women would come to an RV to receive very vulnerable care. And we are a trauma-informed clinic, so we're very focused on understanding that folks come from very different backgrounds, both personally and medically, that might preclude them from getting reproductive health care. And so I built this clinic, and people started coming, and they started to spread the word. And they would tell their friends about us. And mothers started to bring their teenage daughters. And daughters started to bring their friends. And so we have all these circles of people who know each other that trust each other and learn to trust us. And now I can say that if you build something aspirational, you will attract aspirational people. And so the patients that come to my clinic, a lot of them actually have other choices. They have insurance. A lot of them are professionals. They could choose to go somewhere else. And they see what we are trying to do, and they want to be a part of a solution. And it has been extremely gratifying.
I want to go back to the point you made earlier about this care being literally life or death, life-saving. And sometimes that comes in the form of cancer detection, which you wrote about. I'd love to hear you read another passage about this on page 118, and tell us what we should know about this patient, this teacher who came to you for treatment, if anything, before you read.
Sure. This was very early in the life of a clinic. We weren't as busy as we are now. And we learned that this teacher had just gotten discharged after 4 days in a major hospital in the area where she was heavily bleeding. She was in her late 20s. And she, received a blood transfusion. She had been bleeding so much. But she did not receive a diagnosis and was questioning her care. She wondered if it was because she was young. She wondered if it was because she was considered overweight or if she was being treated a certain way because of her race and ethnicity. And so she had heard about us and asked us if we would evaluate her. And on that night, because she was this teacher and couldn't make it in to the clinic during office hours, we actually drove in the rain up to her house and we parked in front of her front lawn. And she came out in her pajamas, and that's what I write about. We did a biopsy in the back of the clinic at 7 o'clock at night. Wow. A few days later, Laura and I sat at our little clinic coffee table, a booth that most families would use to eat breakfast at a campsite. I scrolled through lab results, reviewing numbers and pap smears that dropped into my chart. Adenocarcinoma of the uterus. The words popped out of our patient's pathology report. I did a double take. Adenocarcinoma? In her 20s? Laura, I looked across the table. Her biopsy came back. She has uterine cancer. Whoa, Laura replied. I reread the words and gazed out the window. We were inside a mobile home. From the outside, we could be anybody in Oregon, on a road trip to the coast, driving around the country. But instead, we had parked in front of a teacher's house, invited her inside at 7 o'clock on a rainy night, performed an endometrial biopsy, and diagnosed her with cancer. Our little clinic had done this, without the trappings of a large hospital system, without all of the fuss. Our patient was referred to an oncologist, and with conservative management, she was able to keep her uterus and still consider becoming pregnant one day because her cancer was caught early. It felt like a turning point, and one early in the life of the clinic. We felt that if we could diagnose cancer in the back room, we could do anything.
That is such a beautiful story, and there's so many beautiful stories in the book. And you read what the impact was, but can you tell me a little bit more about how you changed, or the women that you worked with changed after that really momentous event?
I started the clinic really thinking it was about just physical access, geographic access. How do we get to places where you don't have a doctor? So that was the initial impetus for the clinic. And then little by little, the patients started showing up, and they are teaching us what actual access means. So a neurodivergent patient who might have difficulty navigating a big hospital building, or a transgender patient who has to sit in an OB waiting room, a woman who has experienced 6 years of infertility, and now she's surrounded by pregnant, expectant mothers to see her doctor. Instead, we have this space where people drive up in their cars, and they're able to safely wait in the comfort of their own car, as we've gotten used to doing. Yeah. And we text them when it's their turn to come in. And when they enter the clinic, it's just us. It's me and a medical assistant and our patient. And if they want to bring a support person, they're welcome. We sometimes have children running up and down, honking the horns. And I am still in awe and in this process of learning from my patients that when we are willing to show up for them, how incredibly they show back up for us. And I think there's something very mutually beautiful and humbling about that experience.
I wonder if you'd read just a little bit of an exchange you had with a patient who was curious about your personal story.
Yeah, this was a patient who came in, they were non-binary, and they had questions for me about why it was that I chose to provide gender-affirming care at a time when a lot of providers and physicians were maybe opting out of this. My parents left their country in order to provide me with a life where my autonomy was protected, valued, supported, even encouraged, I continued. And now, another version of me, the one that would still be there if my parents hadn't left, is being shot and killed in the streets for daring to show her hair. I listened to my own voice. I had never explained this before. This fight for bodily autonomy, it starts with one person, one torment. And if we do not stand for that, it spreads to all of us. I thought for a moment, then continued. I only recently learned that my grandmother died as a result of attempting an illegal abortion. She left behind 4 young children. How different might things have been for her, for my family? We are only as free as each other is free. Do you know what I mean?
I'd like to end with the story of Amelia, a young adolescent girl, actually barely post-pubescent, that you saw before launching the clinic. You describe her as a child, having a child. How did caring for her change you?
A pregnancy lasts almost a year, and then there's a postpartum period. And so for those of us that meet somebody who's pregnant in the early part of their pregnancy, you're really spending at least an entire year with them. And some of those patients, they stay with you every single day of their pregnancy because they're high risk. You're constantly monitoring them. You want to make sure that you get them to the finish line safely. And so with Amelia, because she was so young and she was in a situation where we didn't know who the father of the baby was, we didn't know who was going to care for her or the baby, we didn't know if she was safe. That pregnancy ate me up, I could say. I mean, it took up an entire year of my life. So despite the fact that I was taking care of other patients, they were more standard situations where they come and you take care of them and they go, and most of the time everything goes well. And in her situation, I kind of talk about how a lot of times I would start my day like a helium balloon, sort of inflated and floating, and with this idea of what I could do as a doctor in this world. And by the end of the day, I might come back low to the ground, like with some of that helium drained and deflated. And that situation taught me that there's a trade-off in this profession to showing up for people and also having a system that makes it difficult sometimes to do everything that you feel like you need to do for them. And you have to accept those limitations. But for me, in accepting those limitations, I really wanted to be able to do something more about it.
You mentioned that we didn't know who the father was, but you had a suspicion that it was a man in the house. And you had great concern over that. And it also pointed out to me how these different, different kinds of protection, you protecting health, social services, hopefully protecting children, how those could work together differently, because it didn't sound like they worked that well when you tried to bring up these concerns.
I don't blame the social services or the detectives that were on the case. I think we were all in the same boat. I think that we can say pretty clearly these days that girls are not being protected. We are not protecting these children. And she was just one stark example of that.
Mary, it was such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your book and for coming in to talk with us about it.
It was so wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Mary Fariba Afsari is an OB-GYN in Portland and the author of Labor, One Woman's Work. That's our show for today. Malia Fass produced this hour, and the other members of the team are me, Rolly Hernandez, Gemma DiCarlo, managing producer Shiraz Sadiq, and of course, our regular host, who's allowing me to be in the chair today, Dave Miller. Nalene Silva and Layla Isbell engineer the show from the Gert Boyle studio. Our technical director is Stephen Cray, and our executive producer is Sage Van Wing. You can listen to any of our past shows wherever you get your podcasts, and our nightly rebroadcast is at 8 p.m. Thanks so much for tuning in to Think Out Loud on OPB and KLCC. I'm Allison Frost. Have a great day. Think Out Loud is supported by Steve and Jan Oliva, the Rose E. Tucker Charitable Trust, Michael, Kristen, Andrew Kern, and Anna Sanford, and the Jackson Foundation.